Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. So, since this is the second part of US Navy ship construction, I thought we'd update the article we created last time. So we're just putting a little cover image there, and this is all in real time, so it gives you an idea about how quickly this all gets done. Squarespace, of course, being primarily a website building tool, but with lots of extra interesting features, well, like this article writing bit, also available to you. So just adjusting the final URL there to reflect more accurately what it is. So there you go. You can now have a nice little cover page. And then we go in. I still need to put the caveats in at some point, but for the purposes of this little placement-short tutorial, we're just going to go into the gallery we created earlier. So you see that, which is there. And then we're just going to say edit. There's the graphs that are there at the moment. Then we just go to add new. And then we go, there we go. There's the new ones, which you'll be seeing in a minute. And again, real-time uploading speeds, at least with my internet connection. Don't worry, the black box is just there because somebody decided to message me while I was recording this, and now that's gone. So there you go. You can see as we scroll down that the new graphs are in there, just as easy as that. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. Well, hello there everybody. It seems that the video on US Navy shipbuilding did generate a fair number of you who wanted to see what the graphs for the US destroyers, destroyer escorts and submarines look like. And so I thought, well, why not get stuck into it? 1100 lines of data later. Oh boy. Wow. That was a thing. Anyway, the data is ready, and it also, apart from, you know, being something along the lines of 3 to 4 times as much data as everything else previously combined, it's also 4 times larger in the other direction, because everything had to be done by quarters rather than by years because of the rather rapid build dates, build times for a lot of these vessels. You know, some of them literally went from keel to launch to commission to sunk inside of 1 year. So the system I use for the larger ships of per year just wouldn't have worked. So caveats somewhat similar to the previous ones. I won't go over them all again. You can watch the first video on US Navy shipbuilding construction and work in World War II if you want the full list. But basically, the way that table that I created works, it defines it by quarter, and it takes the view of what is that ship doing at the end of that quarter. So if it comes into service during that quarter, it shows us in service for that quarter, i.e. it's commissioned. If its keel was laid in that quarter, that's the quarter it shows us building. And if it's lost in that quarter, then the last quarter it's shown in active service is the previous one. So, for example, the ships lost in sort of the big actions at Guadalcanal in November, they show on the table as the last in service in quarter 3 of 1942, because they're lost in quarter 4. But of course, in the graph, that just translates to slight variations on an overall line. Now, these graphs should be accurate to give or take a hull or two. I may admittedly have missed 1 or 2. The hulls shown under construction start with whatever was still under construction at the start of 1938, so it doesn't cover the entire US destroyer fleet, because obviously there were a chunk of destroyers in service and just completing before 1938, so it doesn't show those. This is just about what the US built in World War II and the immediate years before and after. For destroyer escorts, it actually does show all of them, because there weren't any destroyer escorts, as you'll see, built pre-war. They're all wartime builds. And with submarines, interestingly enough, although obviously the US did have a submarine fleet before 1938, as it turns out, if you count from the first proper US fleet submarine, this graph actually shows every single one of them, because the very first US fleet submarine was just about still under construction at the beginning of 1938, commissioning right at the beginning of 1938. So by happy accident, every US fleet sub is present on this particular data table. And in the hopefully very unlikely event that I have missed a hull or two, then, well, you'll see it's not really going to affect the graph all that much, to be perfectly honest. The only other thing is towards the end of the ship's service lives, as per the previous set of graphs. Obviously, if a ship is decommissioned, that's when I show it going out of service, even though it may have been scrapped, expended, transferred to another navy, or even possibly recommissioned much further down the line. That is irrelevant to the ship's actual ability to, actively contribute to the US Navy, which ends when the ship is decommissioned. So that's when the ship disappears off of the graph. And in this particular case, a number of smaller US ships were turned into other ships that weren't frontline combatants, specifically APDs, fast troop transports. So if a ship was taken offline for conversion to an APD, then it's shown as going out of service at the time it was taken in hand for conversion, because an APD is a second line vessel. And if at some point I really feel like punishing myself and I do the auxiliaries and second line vessels of the US Navy in World War II, then, well, they'll go in there. But I suspect that long before that, someone will persuade me to do graphs that include the ships that were already in service prior to 1938, so you get the full chart, if you like, for the larger vessels and possibly also for the destroyers and subs, but we shall see. Anyway, I'm sure you want to see the pretty graphs, so let's do that now. So here's US destroyers. As you can see, there are a few under construction in 1938 and going forwards, but they do have a little bit of lead time. So they're not as slow to build as cruisers, battleships, carriers, etc. But they, at least pre-war, are taking around about 1.5 to 2 years to get fully commissioned. That does come down a bit during the war period itself, but as you can see, in the pre-war period, starting 1938, once again emphasizing these are new builds only, you can see there's a gradual increase in US destroyer numbers through 1939, 1940, 1941, and actually into 1942, because of course, although the US is at war in 1942, by the way, the data markers where it says the various years, that's the start of the year, Q1, and then 2, 3, and 4 in the blank spaces in between. You can see that lag of construction time because there is a dip in destroyers being built in late 1940, but then as you can see, when you get into 1941, at the beginning of 1941, as with cruisers and battleships and all other sorts of things, the US is actually taking things seriously. They're thinking we are probably going to get involved in a war at some point soon. And so you can see in Q1, Q2, Q3, and the bulk of Q4 of 1941, when the US isn't actually at war, the number of destroyers under construction is actually going up very, very fast. Now, the interesting thing, or one of the interesting things about this graph, as you can see, is that actually the number of destroyers under construction peaks in early 1942. It stays fairly high, admittedly, over 100 under construction through until early 1943, but as early as the beginning of 1943, the number of destroyers that the US is building simultaneously is actually dropping. There's a bit of a peak back up again as the gearings start to get going in late 44, but then it gradually drops off as obviously the war ends, destroyers are cancelled, and no new ones are built until the Forrest Shermans. But as you can also see with the orange line, the ships in service, that is just going up and up and up and up and up and up. And there's not really any stopping it till, well, it clears basically 350 in active service at any one time. The maximum effort by the Japanese in late 42 does cause a very slight dip. You can just see as you head towards the end of 42, beginning of 43, the graph, the orange line graph there is just a little bit shallower before it picks up again in 43. That's the sum total impact of the Japanese Navy on US new build destroyer numbers. Yeah. If I hadn't pointed it out to you, would you have guessed? Probably not. And then, as you can see, things just keep going until there's a peak in mid to late 1945, which is understandable. That's kind of the end of the war. And then because destroyers are obviously quite small, very quick to deactivate, you can see the numbers drop off quite catastrophically. But they stabilize at just over 150, which is what the US keeps in service, roughly speaking. And with the numbers coming back up just a little bit at the end of 47 as some later gearings and summoners are just about completing. Now, as I said, it looks like the peak of US destroyer construction is actually in 1942 and it's already trending down in 43. But this is one of the things where date graphs can be slightly deceptive, because when you look at the table, which is an Excel monstrosity I created, so I won't show you that here. Maybe I'll make it available for download at some point. I don't know. Yes, the number of destroyers being laid down is actually going down slightly, and for reasons we'll see a bit later on when we get to the next graph. But also, destroyers are being completed a lot faster. So a destroyer that goes from being laid down to launch to commission inside, say, a year is only going to occupy a slot on that blue line for 3 or 4 quarter blocks before it moves over to the orange line. Whereas in the pre-war period, that destroyer would probably have taken 1.5 to 2 years occupying the blue line. And so what you're actually seeing is probably considerable numbers of destroyers still under construction. It's just the ones before them are getting cleared out the slipways so quickly that the overall numbers simultaneously under construction are actually dropping. Then again, you look at it and it's not until pretty much the end of 1945 that there's less than 50 active destroyers on the slipways at any one time. So yes, it's a drop, but that's a very relative drop. To provide some kind of context, I would point out that when you're looking at some of the higher portions of the line in 42, 40 and early 43, for example, any one of those single quarter data points represents more destroyers under construction in that particular quarter than Japan would lay down during the entirety of their involvement in the Second World War. So yeah, keep that in mind when you're looking at what appears to be a decline in the number of destroyers under construction. And now we come to the destroyer escorts. Now, believe it or not, despite the fact that destroyer escorts are somewhat smaller and considerably simpler to build than the destroyers, as you can immediately see, their overall numbers don't actually peak at all that much more than the total destroyer fleet. But the flip side to that is that the destroyer fleet had been building up since 1938, and as we saw a minute ago, had started rising quite significantly in 1941, whereas as you can see here, the US didn't actually start building any destroyer escorts until pretty much Japan forced them to enter World War II. Then they got very serious about it indeed. As you can see, construction ramped up massively. Within the space of a year, it had gone from nothing being built to about 100 being on the slipways at any one time. And in just over a year, construction would peak in early 1943 at just under 200 destroyer escorts simultaneously on the slipways. And then, again, in a manner similar to the destroyers, but even more obvious because, well, destroyer escorts, say, are quicker to build, the numbers under construction actually drop off very, very, very quickly. To be fair, again, still in 1944, there's still over 100 on the slipways, but that's quite a reduction from almost 200, and that basically almost craters by 1945. There's basically none left on the slipway because it's very obvious that they have enough. Just look at that orange line, and the US is no longer ordering them, and they have like 1 or 2 that are still under construction for various purposes in the immediate aftermath of the war, but that's about it. Now, as you can see from that graph, that means that whilst there's about a 6 to 9 month lag between laying down and commissioning of these ships, once that commissioning starts, oh boy, the numbers build up quickly. So 1943, you start to see the first few enter service, but by 1944, a year later, there's more than 300 of the things floating around in various guises, peaking just towards the end of midpoint of 1944, and then beginning to drop until you can see there the end of the war, where it really starts plunging. Now that drop across 1944-45 is not caused by enemy losses. Again, despite destroyer escorts being quite numerous and a reasonable number of them being sunk, compared to the number built, there's basically zero effect on that line. Where that decline in numbers in the latter part of the war comes from is actually a fair number of them being converted to APDs, the fast troop transports that I mentioned earlier, and a few others being taken offline for various other reasons. But then you hit the end of the war, quarter 3 of 1945, and you can see the numbers catastrophically dropping. Whilst the US would still keep about 150 of its new build destroyers in play, you can see that by 1946, which is basically when Operation Magic Carpet's begun to wrap up, the number has dropped to just over 100, and then as you go into 1947, the numbers continue to drop. There's barely 70 in service by the end of 1947, beginning of 1948, and it will keep going down. They do keep a few of the more modern ones in service, but compared to their all-time peak, destroyer escorts, much like escort carriers actually, are pretty much a fly-by-night operation. They exist for, in large numbers, basically 3 years or so, and then they're gone almost as quickly as they've arrived. Then again, they do later get renamed to frigates, and as we know, frigates do continue to be a thing in all major navies, including the US Navy. So this is the start of what for the US Navy would be the frigate, ending as of currently with the OHPs, but to be revived soon enough with the Constellations. And then we move on to our second to last graph, the submarines. Now the submarines have one of the more interesting curves, and like the battleship curve versus the carrier curve, this kind of also indicates where US priorities lay. There's a relatively continuous production of submarines in the pre-war period. There's not any significant dip like there is with destroyer construction numbers, and there's a corresponding steady flow of submarines coming into service. However, as you can see, whilst there's not the stratospheric jump in numbers that destroyers and destroyer escorts show in terms of construction, there's a gradual ramping up of numbers under construction, and this under construction graph is actually the latest peaking of them all. So the highest number of subs under construction is just about 80 in early 1944. Although, as you can see, as it becomes clear that the war is very much going the Allies' way, numbers under construction drop off quite sharply through 44 and 45, with significant numbers of things like Tench-class submarines actually being flat-out cancelled, and some others being stopped while they're partway under construction. Although, as you can see, even in the immediate post-war period, there are still a handful that are kept under construction for various purposes. Some of those are just building, a few others are actually suspended, but technically have minor works being carried out until they can decide what they're going to finish them as. But of the 3 graphs in this particular video that concern specific combat classes, as opposed to the general one we're going to come to in a second, submarines are the one where you can probably see the overall effect the most of enemy action. So you can see going into 1941, then if you look at towards the end of 41 into 42, you can see the graph becoming somewhat shallower, and it struggles a little bit to pick up going towards 43. It's at a slightly shallower angle there. That's the reflection of losses to the US fleet subs. And although the graph then gets steeper and steeper until it starts to peak in late late 44, early 45, which is basically towards the end of the war, while it's an impressively rising graph, it does reflect the fact that there are a relatively continuous stream of losses, a bit in excess of what the destroyers and destroyer escorts are suffering. But then, whilst losses will continue late in the war, you can see by kind of mid 44, the US Navy has begun to not so much get the upper hand, but get a position of almost, not quite, but almost sea dominance over the Japanese. And the graph starts to climb somewhat more steeply in mid 44 as losses are curtailed somewhat. And then the graph, as I say, tops out basically because construction is finishing. And this is probably the graph where you can see the closest correlation between construction and service. And you can see almost exactly how long the gap between a boat under construction and the boat coming into service is. It's just a fraction over a year. But once again, obviously fair number of boats are decommissioned following the cessation of the war in 1945. But there is a rather clear levelling out there at around about 80 boats, which is what the US keeps in service in the latter part of the 1940s, pending more boats coming into service, at which point numbers will probably climb again for a little bit. But most of these boats that are very rapidly decommissioned are the older ones, the pre-war fleet designs, some of the earlier Gatos or Gatos or whatever you want to call them. But the Balaus and Tenches are mostly retained in service. So, yeah, the interesting thing about all of this is that peak numbers under simultaneous construction are very different for these three classes of small surface combatant. The destroyers peak the earliest. The destroyer escorts basically just appear and then disappear. They're the mayflies of the shipbuilding world. And the submarines have the gentlest ramp up, but the latest peak, both in terms of building and numbers in service. And that brings us to this graph. So this combines all three that we've just seen, combat ships under 5,000 tons. So this is destroyers, destroyer escorts, and submarines all put together. And when it's all combined, you can see that there is a gradual upswing in US fleet numbers in the pre-war period, up to kind of late quarter 4 and then beginning of quarter 1, 42. But once again, you can see the US preparing for war because the number of vessels under construction kicks off in early 41 and is already well on its way to ramping up. They've got over 100 vessels of this under 5,000 ton category under construction at the time of the Japanese attack. And the adjusted peak for all three types combined is in early to mid 1943, when you have just a bit over 300 hulls, well, actually close to 350 hulls under simultaneous construction, which, shockingly enough, is just around about the time that the numbers start to spike quite considerably in terms of overall hull numbers. Now, with all of these combined and adjusted, you can see the slightly shallower curve that is the harsh learning curve of 1942 for the US Navy, but you can also pretty much see exactly where both they overcome that generally in terms of reducing their own losses and starting to inflict lots of losses on Japan, and this increasing pace of shipbuilding construction comes into its own, as in 1943 the graph just goes whee up and away, and then in early 44, as they realise the war's pretty much in the bag, as it were, the total numbers start to trail off a little bit in terms of their rise, and then in early 45, war ends, and, well, the cuts kind of speak for themselves. By 47, well, they're down to a mere 300 hulls for combat ships under 5,000 tons. However, will they survive? Now, I know some people are going to ask, can you combine this graph with the combat ships over 5,000 tons to give us an idea of the total amount of US shipbuilding efforts in World War II? The answer is, in theory, I can, but that would require me to go back into the data for the combat ships above 5,000 tons, so the cruisers, carriers, and battleships, and convert all of that from a yearly format to a quarterly format. And, well, that's going to take a bit of time. So if you think that that's something you'd like to see, let me know and I'll consider doing that. But Well, I might do that towards the end of the summer because, well, having processed another 1,100 lines of US shipbuilding, or slightly over that, I think I'm Excel'd out for the next few weeks, I think. Anyway, thanks very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this little addendum to the previous video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.